I booked an Airbnb in a rural part of the state because I wanted quiet. I had been working too much, feeling burned out, and thought a few days away in the country would give me the reset I needed. The listing was simple: a small guest house behind an older couple's property, surrounded by trees, with a gravel driveway that wound off the main road. The pictures showed a neat little place with a bed, kitchenette, bathroom, and a tiny patio. Nothing fancy, but that was what I wanted. The owners weren't there when I checked in. They left a key in a lockbox and a welcome binder on the counter. The binder looked like the kind of thing you find in hotels: laminated pages, typed out instructions, restaurant recommendations, emergency numbers. I skimmed through it while I unpacked. It had all the normal things: Wi-Fi password, how to work the TV, rules about no smoking inside, where to take trash. But buried in the middle, after a page about water usage, was a single line that stopped me cold. Don't go outside after 11 p.m. There was no explanation. No warning about animals, no mention of safety concerns. Nothing. Just that one instruction in plain text, formatted the same as everything else. It was so out of place that I read it twice, even flipped the page back and forth to see if I had missed something. But that was it. Just a line in the binder, sitting there like it belonged. At first, I thought it was odd, maybe even a joke, but I tried not to dwell on it. People in the country are particular about their property. Maybe the owners didn't want guests wandering the yard at night. Maybe there were coyotes or even black bears in the area. It wasn't worth obsessing over. The first evening was uneventful. I made myself dinner, read a book, and sat on the little patio until the sun went down. The woods around the guest house grew darker than I was used to. No streetlights, no glow from nearby houses, just black trees against a sky that turned purple and then vanished into night. I went inside around 10, locked the door, and tried to ignore the binder's words echoing in the back of my head. By 11, the place was silent. I lay in bed with the window cracked, listening to crickets and the occasional rustle in the brush. My phone showed the time creep past 11:03, 11:10, 11:17. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was waiting for something, like the binder had planted an idea I couldn't get rid of. At some point, I drifted into a shallow sleep. A sound woke me later, sharp enough to snap me upright. It was past midnight. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a branch breaking under weight. Then I heard it again. Not close, but not far either. A deliberate crunch of gravel on the driveway. Slow, evenly spaced. I froze, listening hard. The guest house was small, so every sound outside carried inside easily. I held my breath. Another crunch. And another. Someone was walking the driveway. My first thought was that it must be the owners. Maybe they'd come back late. But the steps didn't move toward the main house. They stopped near the guest house, then shifted, circling. I could picture it without seeing. Someone walking slowly around the building, gravel shifting under their feet. I slid out of bed and moved to the window, careful not to let the curtain swing. Through a narrow gap, I could see the yard dimly lit by the moon. Empty, just trees and the dirt clearing. But the sound kept going. Crunch, pause, crunch. Whoever it was stayed just out of sight. I stepped back, my pulse racing. That line in the binder came back hard. Don't go outside after 11 p.m. At that moment, I understood it differently. It wasn't about me wandering. It was about something else being out there. The footsteps dragged on for what felt like forever. Sometimes closer, sometimes fading, but never gone. I sat in the chair near the door, clutching my phone, debating whether to call the police. What would I even say? That I was staying in a rental and someone was walking outside? They might send a car, but by the time it arrived, whoever was out there would be long gone. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the sounds stopped. I strained to listen, ears ringing from the effort, but the gravel was silent again. Slowly, the crickets returned. The night went back to normal. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the window, waiting for movement that never came. When morning came, I stepped outside carefully. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. The gravel driveway stretched out as it had before. But near the side of the guest house, I saw them, footprints pressed into the stones. Not boot marks, not sneakers, just vague depressions in the loose rock. They went around the building and disappeared into the trees. I didn't see anyone else that day. The main house looked quiet, no cars, no movement. I thought about leaving early, but I had paid for the stay and convinced myself that maybe it had been nothing. A trespasser, a neighbor, some local who liked to walk the property at night. The second night, I tried to relax. I locked the door early, closed the blinds tight, and put in headphones to drown out outside noises. Still, at 11 sharp, I felt a shift in the air. Even through the music, I thought I felt vibrations in the floor, as if footsteps moved outside again. I didn't check this time. I just lay stiff in bed, waiting it out. By the third day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The binder, the footprints, the timing. Everything pointed to one thing: the owners knew. They knew something happened on their property at night. Instead of explaining, they left that single line, as if warning guests without taking responsibility. I never saw the owners once during my stay. They didn't message me, didn't stop by, nothing. It was like they wanted no contact at all. That unsettled me even more. On my last night, I packed early so I could leave first thing in the morning. I set my bags by the door and tried to sleep in my clothes. Around midnight, it came again. That crunch of gravel, slow, patient, circling. I stayed still, not daring to move. After a while, I heard something brush against the siding, like fingertips dragging lightly across the wall. My throat went dry. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles hurt, ready to call someone, anyone, if the door handle turned. But it never did. The sounds lingered for a long time, then faded again. When dawn finally came, I grabbed my bags and left without looking back. The driveway stretched empty behind me, but I still felt watched as I pulled onto the road. Later that week, I went back to the listing out of curiosity. The photos were still there, the description unchanged. I checked the reviews again. Most were positive, people praising the quiet, the privacy. But buried a few months back, I found one short review that hadn't registered before. It said only, "Beautiful place, but strange nights. Wish I had known more before booking." I didn't leave a review. I couldn't bring myself to. What would I even write? That I was warned not to go outside after 11. And now I understand why. That the binder was the only honesty I got. All I know is that I'll never forget those footsteps circling in the dark, steady and deliberate, waiting for someone to ignore the one rule hidden in plain sight. And I'll never book another place without wondering what unspoken rules might be buried between the lines. I had booked the Airbnb for a weekend alone, the kind of break where you do nothing but read, rest, and let time pass without pressure. The cabin was small but modern, tucked at the edge of the woods, about 10 minutes outside a quiet town. It had everything I needed: kitchen, a little sitting area, one bedroom, and a bathroom with a large mirror above the sink. The listing had emphasized how clean and minimal it was, and when I first walked in, I believed it. Everything looked polished, even staged, the kind of place that photographs well. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, made myself a simple dinner, and walked around the property. Nothing felt out of place. The silence in the woods pressed in but didn't feel threatening, just empty. Inside, the space smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, which gave me the impression that someone had been there not long before me, wiping everything down. It wasn't until the second day that I noticed the bathroom mirror. I had splashed some water on it while brushing my teeth in the morning and later came back with a cloth to clean it. At first, it seemed like any other mirror, large, rectangular, smooth glass. But as I wiped the surface, the way the light hit it caught my eye. It didn't reflect the way I expected. The glass seemed darker, almost like it was absorbing some of the light rather than bouncing it back. I leaned closer. The reflection showed me clearly enough, but if I pressed my face near the glass, I could see a dimness beyond my own image. The more I stared, the more unsettled I felt. It didn't seem like a solid wall was behind the glass. It looked hollow, like there was space. Curiosity turned into dread as I did the simple test I remembered hearing about. I pressed my fingertip against the glass. Normally, with a regular mirror, your finger and its reflection would appear separated by a slight gap. Here, my fingertip touched its reflection directly, without any space. That's when it hit me, it was a two-way mirror. The thought made my stomach twist. I backed up, staring at the rectangle of glass that had seemed so ordinary an hour earlier. Now it looked like an open eye watching me. I hadn't noticed it before because I hadn't paid attention. I thought about every moment I had used the bathroom since arriving, washing up, brushing teeth, undressing for a shower. Every second of it might have been seen from the other side. Couldn't leave it alone. My nerves wouldn't allow me to ignore it. I started looking for a way to confirm what was behind the glass. The mirror was set into the wall with a frame, but there was a small gap at the bottom where it wasn't flush. I bent down and shined my phone's flashlight upward into the crack. The beam didn't bounce back the way it should have against a wall. Instead, it disappeared into a dark space. That was all I needed to know. There was a room behind the mirror. I stood in the bathroom, pulse hammering in my chest, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to grab my things and leave right away. But the problem was clear. The cabin sat in the woods, and my car was the only way out. The dirt road back to town felt longer in my head than it had driving in. Leaving immediately might mean running into whoever had set this up, or worse, into whoever might be sitting in that hidden room right now. I forced myself to keep moving, to at least check the rest of the cabin. I walked through each room, looking for doors or panels that might lead to the space behind the mirror. At first, I found nothing, just plain walls, closets with extra bedding, the small kitchen cabinets. Then I noticed a subtle difference in the hallway wall, just a few feet down from the bathroom. The paint there was slightly lighter, as if it had been touched up. I pressed against it, and to my horror, the panel shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, but with enough pressure, the section of wall clicked and opened like a door. Behind it, a narrow passage led into the hidden room. I didn't want to go in, but I also couldn't turn my back on it without knowing. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and what I saw made my skin crawl. The hidden room was small, barely the size of a closet, but set directly behind the bathroom wall. A chair sat in the center, facing the two-way mirror. An old extension cord ran along the floor, powering a small space heater and an empty outlet. On the chair was a blanket, folded carelessly, and next to it on the floor were a few empty water bottles. Someone had been there recently. The smell in the small room was stale, a mix of dust and something sour, like sweat left to dry. The chair legs had scraped marks into the wooden floor from being moved back and forth. This wasn't a space for storage, it was a space for watching. My throat felt dry as I pulled back out of the passage and shut the panel as quietly as I could. Every hair on my body was standing. I knew then that I couldn't stay another night. Someone had set this cabin up to spy on whoever rented it. Maybe they recorded, maybe they just watched, maybe both. Either way, it meant I had been seen without knowing it. I packed fast, throwing everything into my bag without caring how neat it was. Every sound in the cabin felt magnified, like the creak of the floorboards and the zip of my backpack would draw someone out of the woods. My hands shook so badly that I dropped my keys once before I finally managed to lock the door behind me. The drive out felt endless. The dirt road stretched forever, each bend making me check my rearview mirror. I kept expecting another car to appear behind me, headlights flashing through the trees. But no one came. When I finally reached the highway, the relief was so sharp it hurt. In town, I stopped at the first open building, which happened to be a gas station. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, the bag beside me on the passenger seat. My hands were still trembling. I thought about calling the police right then, but another wave of dread hit me. If I reported it, I would have to explain what I had seen, maybe even go back with them to the cabin. The idea of stepping into that bathroom again, facing that mirror, made me feel sick. Eventually, I did report it, but only after I was far from the area. I wrote down everything in as much detail as I could and sent it to the platform as well. Whether anything was done about it, I never found out. The listing disappeared weeks later, but that didn't mean much. What stuck with me wasn't just the room or the chair. It was the knowledge that someone had sat there, hidden, so close while I went about my stay. I hadn't felt watched because I hadn't thought to look. Now, every time I walk into a bathroom in a hotel, rental, or even a friend's place, I check the mirror. I press my finger against the glass. I shine a light at the edges, because once you've seen what I saw, you can't unsee it. You can't forget the feeling of realizing the reflection in front of you might not be reflecting at all. It might be showing you to someone else. I booked the Airbnb because it seemed private, quiet, and far away from everything. The photos showed a small log cabin tucked back in the woods. No neighbors in sight, just a dirt road winding in from the main highway and stopping at the front yard. It was the kind of place where you expected silence, the kind of silence that felt like a relief when you wanted to get away from normal life. The listing mentioned that the cabin was about 12 miles from the nearest town, but at the time that felt like part of the charm. I thought having a car would make that distance meaningless. The first day went as planned. I drove out on the narrow road, gravel crunching under the tires. Watching the tree line thicken the deeper I went in. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Dark wood, a small front porch, 2 rocking chairs, and a single lantern hanging by the door. I parked my car just a few steps from the porch and unloaded everything I had brought. Once the sun went down, I settled inside, cooked a small meal, and listened to the stillness outside. It was almost too quiet, but I told myself that was the reason I came in the first place. That night, I went to sleep in the loft bedroom, the kind with a slanted ceiling and one small window looking out toward the yard. I fell asleep without much trouble. But sometime in the early morning, I woke up and noticed something odd. The window gave me a view of where my car had been parked. The space looked darker than it should have. At first I thought maybe it was the way the moonlight hit the ground, but after rubbing my eyes and staring longer, I realized the car was gone. I went downstairs barefoot, heart pounding. I opened the front door and stepped out into the cold air. The yard was empty. The patch of dirt and flattened grass where my car had sat the night before was bare. I walked over to it, half expecting my eyes to adjust and the car to appear in the shadows, but there was nothing. The road that led back to the highway stretched into darkness, and I felt my stomach twist. I checked the door to the cabin. It had been locked from the inside. No windows were broken. Nothing else seemed disturbed. Whoever took the car must have come quietly, walked right up to the yard, and driven away without me hearing a thing. The thought made me shiver because I had been asleep not more than 30 feet away. The rest of that morning, I wandered the cabin in circles, trying to figure out what to do. My phone had almost no service. I could get 1 bar at most, and the calls wouldn't connect. Texts would sometimes send, but I couldn't count on it. There was no Wi-Fi at the cabin either, which I had known before booking but hadn't thought would be a problem. Now it meant I was cut off. I thought about walking the 12 miles to town, but the road felt endless even when driving, and I hadn't brought the right gear for a long hike. The woods pressed close on either side, thick with brush, and there were no houses or farms on the way in. Just trees, the dirt road, and the occasional ditch. I pictured myself walking it in silence, not sure if someone might pass me or if I'd end up stuck out there when the sun went down. The day dragged on. I searched the cabin for anything useful, maps, supplies, maybe an emergency radio. There was nothing but old magazines, a few kitchen tools, and some spare blankets. Every time I glanced out the window, the emptiness of the yard bothered me. The car had been my link to safety, and now the bare dirt looked almost like a wound in the ground, reminding me I had no way out. I tried to ration the food I had brought, mostly canned items, snacks, and a gallon of water. Enough to last a few days if I stretched it, but not much longer. I kept thinking about how quickly people could vanish out here without anyone noticing. The owner of the Airbnb lived several hours away, and I had only messaged them once to confirm my arrival. I doubted they'd check in again unless I reached out, and with no service, I couldn't. That night was worse. I lay awake in the loft, listening to every creak and snap outside. A raccoon or deer moving through the brush could have explained some of it, but I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had taken the car might still be close. They had come once without me hearing. What would stop them from coming back? At one point, I thought I saw movement near the road, just a flicker of shape between the trees. My body froze. I stayed still at the window for nearly an hour, staring until my eyes ached. but nothing else moved. Still, the unease never left me. By morning, I knew I couldn't wait around. I packed what I could carry in a small bag: water, food, a flashlight, and a jacket, and decided to walk toward town. The road stretched endlessly ahead, pale dirt with the forest pressing close on both sides. Every sound, rustling leaves, the caw of a crow, made me glance over my shoulder. I half expected to hear an engine roar behind me, my own car coming back down the road, but it stayed silent. Hours passed. My legs ached, and the sun climbed higher. Sweat dampened my back. I realized how far 12 miles really was when you were walking it without brakes, especially with the constant sense of being watched. Once or twice I stopped and listened, certain I had heard footsteps behind me, but the road was empty each time I turned. By late afternoon, the first signs of town finally appeared. Faint sounds of traffic, a few power lines cutting across the sky. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with something else. Whoever had taken the car had stranded me out there on purpose. They hadn't just stolen a vehicle. They had left me isolated, miles from help, with no way to contact anyone. At the police station, I gave a report. They wrote everything down and promised to look into it, but their faces told me they had seen this before. Cars got stolen. People left doors unlocked. Maybe it would turn up in another state, stripped for parts. To them, it was routine. To me, it was something much darker. Someone had been close enough to take my car while I slept, close enough to walk up to the cabin in silence, knowing I was inside and helpless. I never went back to that Airbnb to collect my things. I left everything behind: the blankets, the food, even the clothes I had unpacked. The thought of going back onto that dirt road, back into the woods where my car had vanished, made my skin crawl. The silence that had first felt peaceful now felt like a trap. In the end, the car was never found. No one was ever caught. What stayed with me wasn't just the loss of the vehicle. It was the memory of standing barefoot in the cold dirt that first morning, staring at the empty space where it had been. The realization that someone had been right there, outside the cabin, while I was sleeping above, and I hadn't heard a thing. That detail never left me. When I think back on it now, what scares me most isn't the car itself, but the fact that whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just steal something valuable. They left me stranded in a place where I had no escape. And that felt like more than theft. Felt like a warning. I rented a cabin through Airbnb for a long weekend, thinking it would be the kind of quiet, simple escape I needed. The listing showed a one-bedroom place in the woods, with a porch, a fire pit, and hiking trails nearby. The photos looked charming: wooden walls, cozy furniture, a gravel driveway leading to nothing but trees. It felt private, which is what I was after. When I pulled up, the place was exactly as pictured. The cabin sat on a little clearing with the woods pressing in close behind it. I noticed something the photos hadn't shown, though: a shed. It was tucked at the edge of the clearing, behind the cabin, almost hidden under low branches. It was old, paint peeling, with a heavy steel padlock on the front. The lock caught the sun in a way that stood out against the rotting wood, like it was newer than everything around it. I unloaded my bags, glanced at the shed again, and shrugged it off. Lots of people keep extra storage on their property. The lock probably meant the owners didn't want guests messing around with their tools. I didn't think much about it as I settled in. The cabin was comfortable inside. A small living room with a sagging couch, a kitchenette with just enough to cook simple meals, a bedroom tucked in the back. The hosts had left a little welcome note and some firewood stacked neatly by the door. By evening, I had cooked dinner, poured a drink, and was sitting on the porch listening to the woods settle into night. It got dark quickly, the kind of darkness you only get away from towns and roads, where the trees swallow up whatever light the sky still had. I heard crickets, the occasional snap of a branch, even what sounded like a coyote far off. The shed was just a darker shape in the clearing, but even in the dark, the metal padlock caught the moonlight. I went inside before it got too late and read for a while in bed. Around midnight, I turned out the light, rolled over, and let the silence press in. That's when I heard it. A thump, faint at first, but steady. I held still, listening hard. Another thump followed, louder, then a scrape like something dragging against wood. It was coming from outside, specifically behind the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart picking up speed, and listened again. The sound came in bursts. Thump, pause, scrape, another thump. The realization hit me slowly, but once it landed it was obvious. The shed. The sound was coming from the shed. I stayed frozen, debating what to do. Every few seconds the noise repeated, shaking the still night. It wasn't the wind. The trees outside were still, no branches brushing. It wasn't an animal scurrying on the roof. It was too rhythmic, too heavy. Something inside that shed was moving hard enough to make the walls shift. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and waited. The sound went on for several minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence after was worse. I lay there for hours, wide awake. Every small creak of the cabin amplified until morning light finally pushed in through the blinds. When I stepped outside at daylight, the shed sat there as before, padlocked, quiet. I walked closer, trying to spot anything unusual. The dirt around it looked disturbed, the ground soft with scattered leaves kicked out of place. The padlock hung straight, secure. I tugged it out of curiosity, but it didn't budge. I told myself maybe an animal had gotten trapped inside. A raccoon, maybe. Something had gotten in before it was locked. That explanation calmed me enough to get through the day. I hiked, cooked, and tried to distract myself, but by evening my thoughts kept circling back to the shed. I couldn't shake the image of something moving around inside, trying to get out. As dusk fell, the air grew cooler, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder at it every time I stepped onto the porch. That night, just after midnight, it started again. Louder this time, a bang so sharp it rattled the glass in the bedroom window. I bolted upright. The sound came in quick bursts, like someone slamming against the inside walls. The shed shook hard enough that I could hear the wood creaking under the strain. I sat rigid on the bed, staring into the dark, every nerve on fire. It wasn't just once or twice. The banging went on in steady bursts, then stopped, then started again minutes later. Between each round, silence stretched, thick and waiting. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That a locked shed on private property seemed to have something inside? They'd probably chalk it up to an animal and tell me not to worry. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lamp on, sat in the chair by the window, and waited out the hours until dawn. When the gray morning light finally crept across the clearing, I forced myself outside again. The shed looked worse now. The walls had marks on them, faint but visible. Scratches ran across the wood, some vertical, some diagonal, cutting through the peeling paint. The ground around the base was even more disturbed, as though something had been pressing hard against the inside and shifting the foundation slightly. The padlock still held. I didn't touch it this time. I just backed away slowly and went inside, locking the cabin door. By the third night, my nerves were shredded. I sat awake long before anything started, listening, waiting. Sure enough, just after midnight, the banging began again. Harder than before, so loud it shook the air. I could hear the lock clanging against the hasp with every blow. I pressed my hands over my ears, but I could still feel the vibrations through the floor. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence. Not the slow tapering of sound, but a cut, like whatever was inside had gone still. The silence stretched so long I began to think it was over for good. Then came one final bang, loud enough to make me jump, and then nothing. I didn't wait for morning this time. I threw everything into my bag, loaded the car, and drove off before the sun came up. The shed stood in my rearview mirror, still and dark, the padlock flashing once in the beams of my taillights as I left the clearing behind. Later, after I was home, I looked back at the Airbnb listing. It was gone, removed completely. No photos, no host, nothing. Like it had never been there. I'll never know what was in that shed. Maybe it really was an animal, though I can't explain the force of those bangs or the way the ground looked torn up. Maybe it was storage, though I don't know what kind of stored item could move like that. All I know is that something was in there, and the hosts had locked it away behind a padlock, and that I spent 3 nights listening to it try to get out. I booked the Airbnb because I wanted space and quiet. The listing showed a small cabin tucked away at the edge of the woods, a gravel drive curling up to it, and nothing but trees behind. It looked peaceful, and the reviews all mentioned how private it felt, which was what I needed. No traffic, no neighbors, just silence and forest. When I arrived, it was exactly as described. The cabin was small but clean, with a porch that faced a wide stretch of grass before the tree line began. The woods rose up thick and dark, dense enough that you couldn't see far into them. I unpacked, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The only sounds were crickets, wind in the leaves, and the occasional groan of the old boards under my chair. By the time it got dark, the trees blended together into one black wall. I sat outside longer than I meant to, just enjoying how quiet it was. At one point, though, I caught myself staring too long at the tree line. The way the shadows layered made it feel like something was there. My eyes kept picking shapes out of the dark that weren't really there. I laughed it off, went inside, and locked up for the night. The next morning, I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was just high enough to light up the clearing, throwing long shadows behind the trees. I was sipping my coffee when I froze. There was someone standing at the edge of the woods. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person. Tall, still, facing the cabin. They didn't move. I stared, half expecting them to wave or step forward, but nothing happened. The figure stayed planted at the tree line, so still it looked unnatural. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again, and they were still there. Finally, I stepped back inside, telling myself it was probably a trick of the light. When I looked again a few minutes later, the figure was gone. I spent most of the day trying not to think about it. I drove into town, grabbed supplies, and reminded myself the woods weren't private property. Hikers passed through places like this all the time. Maybe someone had just been cutting through early in the morning. Still, the image of that still figure facing the cabin stuck with me. That evening, I sat by the window as the sky dimmed. I kept glancing at the tree line, half daring myself to see something. And I did. As the light faded, there it was again, a person standing just inside the shadows of the trees. Same spot, same stillness, facing directly toward me. I felt a cold wave roll through me. It wasn't just the fact that someone was there. It was the way they stood. No shifting weight, no turning, no moving at all. Just rooted in place like they had been waiting all day for me to look. I shut the curtains and tried to distract myself. But later, when I peeked out again, they were still there, unmoving. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin set my nerves on edge. When morning finally came, I forced myself to check again. The tree line was empty. I told myself I wouldn't look again. If it was someone messing with me, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I spent the whole next day reading, cooking, trying to pretend everything was fine. But by late afternoon, my eyes drifted back to the window, and sure enough, the figure was there. Same place, still as stone. This time I stared longer. I wanted to see movement, anything to prove it was a trick of my mind. But no, the longer I looked, the more certain I was. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't my imagination. It was someone watching. My chest tightened. I kept thinking about how far the cabin was from town, how isolated it really was. The driveway was a mile of gravel with nothing around. If someone wanted to mess with me out here, no one would know. I shut the curtains again, but every time I passed the window, I felt the pull to check. By nightfall, I couldn't stop myself. Peeked out once more. The figure was closer. Not by much, but closer than before. Still standing, still facing the cabin. That was the moment panic really set in. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were staying there, waiting. I locked every door, every window. I kept the lights on all night and sat in a chair facing the front window with a heavy flashlight clutched in my hand. Hours crawled by. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I dozed off despite myself. When I jolted awake again, it was just starting to get light. I went straight to the window. The figure was gone. I didn't wait around this time. I packed my bag, shoved everything into the car, and drove off before the sun fully rose. The woods on either side of the driveway felt like they were pressing in, and I kept scanning the tree line as I drove, half expecting to see that same still figure watching me go. When I got home, I checked the Airbnb listing. I was ready to leave a warning, something about how exposed the cabin felt, how strange the area was. But the listing had been pulled down. No host, no photos, nothing. It was like the place didn't exist anymore. I've stayed in a lot of rentals since then, but I always check the surroundings now. I look at the tree lines, the edges of the property, the places where someone could stand and watch without being seen, because that's what stuck with me the most. The way that figure never moved, never spoke, never came closer. They just stood there watching, as if the only purpose they had was to be seen. And I know for a fact it wasn't my imagination, because every time I looked, they were there, closer, always closer. I booked the Airbnb because I wanted space and quiet. The listing showed a small cabin tucked away at the edge of the woods, a gravel drive curling up to it, and nothing but trees behind. It looked peaceful, and the reviews all mentioned how private it felt, which was what I needed. No traffic, no neighbors, just silence and forest. When I arrived, it was exactly as described. The cabin was small but clean, with a porch that faced a wide stretch of grass before the tree line began. The woods rose up thick and dark, dense enough that you couldn't see far into them. I unpacked, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The only sounds were crickets, wind in the leaves, and the occasional groan of the old boards under my chair. By the time it got dark, the trees blended together into one black wall. I sat outside longer than I meant to, just enjoying how quiet it was. At one point, though, I caught myself staring too long at the tree line. The way the shadows layered made it feel like something was there. My eyes kept picking shapes out of the dark that weren't really there. I laughed it off, went inside, and locked up for the night. The next morning, I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was just high enough to light up the clearing, throwing long shadows behind the trees. I was sipping my coffee when I froze. There was someone standing at the edge of the woods. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person. Tall, still, facing the cabin. They didn't move. I stared, half expecting them to wave or step forward, but nothing happened. The figure stayed planted at the tree line, so still it looked unnatural. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again, and they were still there. Finally, I stepped back inside, telling myself it was probably a trick of the light. When I looked again a few minutes later, the figure was gone. I spent most of the day trying not to think about it. I drove into town, grabbed supplies, and reminded myself the woods weren't private property. Hikers pass through places like this all the time. Maybe someone had just been cutting through early in the morning. Still, the image of that still figure facing the cabin stuck with me. That evening, I sat by the window as the sky dimmed. I kept glancing at the tree line, half daring myself to see something. And I did. As the light faded, there it was again, a person standing just inside the shadows of the trees. Same spot, same stillness, facing directly toward me. I felt a cold wave roll through me. It wasn't just the fact that someone was there. It was the way they stood. No shifting weight, no turning, no moving at all. Just rooted in place like they had been waiting all day for me to look. I shut the curtains and tried to distract myself. But later, when I peeked out again, they were still there, unmoving. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin set my nerves on edge. When morning finally came, I forced myself to check again. The tree line was empty. I told myself I wouldn't look again. If it was someone messing with me, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I spent the whole next day reading, cooking, trying to pretend everything was fine. But by late afternoon, my eyes drifted back to the window. And sure enough, the figure was there. Same place, still as stone. This time I stared longer. I wanted to see movement, anything to prove it was a trick of my mind. But no, the longer I looked, the more certain I was. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't my imagination. It was someone. watching. My chest tightened. I kept thinking about how far the cabin was from town, how isolated it really was. The driveway was a mile of gravel with nothing around. If someone wanted to mess with me out here, no one would know. I shut the curtains again, but every time I passed the window, I felt the pull to check. By nightfall, I couldn't stop myself. Peeked out once more. The figure was closer. Not by much, but closer than before. Still standing, still facing the cabin. That was the moment panic really set in. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were staying there, waiting. I locked every door, every window. I kept the lights on all night and sat in a chair facing the front window with a heavy flashlight clutched in my hand. Hours crawled by. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I dozed off despite myself. When I jolted awake again, it was just starting to get light. I went straight to the window. The figure was gone. I didn't wait around this time. I packed my bag, shoved everything into the car, and drove off before the sun fully rose. The woods on either side of the driveway felt like they were pressing in, and I kept scanning the tree line as I drove, half expecting to see that same still figure watching me go. When I got home, I checked the Airbnb listing. I was ready to leave a warning, something about how exposed the cabin felt, how strange the area was. But the listing had been pulled down. No host, no photos, nothing. It was like the place didn't exist anymore. I've stayed in a lot of rentals since then, but I always check the surroundings now. I look at the tree lines, the edges of the property, the places where someone could stand and watch without being seen, because that's what stuck with me the most. The way that figure never moved, never spoke, never came closer. They just stood there watching, as if the only purpose they had was to be seen. And I know for a fact it wasn't my imagination, because every time I looked, they were there. Closer, always closer.